There was an idea to bring together a group of remarkable people to see if they could become something more. To see if they could read Reddit horror stories with atmospheric background music and release them as podcasts. And in the beginning, that's exactly what they did. And they called it the Nosleep Podcast. And it wasn't very good, at least not in the beginning. For the first couple seasons of the Nosleep Podcast, it was literally just that. Just these voice actors reading Reddit horror stories from r/nosleep with some background music and some nice little like DJing from David Cummings. But over time, it developed into something much bigger. And that really began around like the end of season 2 to the beginning of season 3, where they kind of started to find their footing. They started airing slightly higher quality stories. I think that's around the time where they started actually like getting audience submissions and stuff like that. And pretty quickly, the podcast began a sort of uphill trajectory that led to a real peak around season 6. Which, as you'll see when we get into this top 40 list, is by far and away the most highly represented season in the ranking. And season 6, I think, still is the peak of quality that this podcast has ever reached. But just because it's the peak doesn't mean that everything afterwards was bad by any means. Because I'd say like season 7 through 12 was all pretty solid, pretty decent stuff. There was a lot of good episodes, and the general average quality was about what it was in those early like 3 to 5 seasons, and so things were pretty good. It was really around season 13 where things started to go on a bit of a gradual downhill trajectory, and that continued up through season 19, which was basically like the end of like the podcast being good. And since then, since we've gotten into like season 20 and beyond, these days the podcast just is not really what it used to be. The stories that they're selecting to read are just not very good, and I can't tell if it's because they are like deliberately choosing these kind of like juvenile bland stories because they want to be more advertiser friendly, or if it's just that they've like literally run out of good submissions and good stories to air. It's hard to know, but honestly, these days, hearing a good story on the podcast is pretty rare. It's pretty much dead. But in this video, I want to basically make this a love letter to the glory days of the Nosleep Podcast, which is like season 3 to season 19. That's a pretty damn good run. A pretty solid run in which a lot of really good stories got aired. And yes, occasionally you would get a Purity Falls, or a Tales of the Mooncrawler Part 1, or a Curse of the Gilded Echo Part 3. You know, these really just god-awful stories. But honestly, those were pretty rare, pretty sparse, and in general, the quality of the podcast throughout that 3 to 19 area zone was really good. And I have a lot of nostalgia for this podcast. I've really enjoyed it over the years, and so I want to basically share my love for this podcast with you guys, with the audience, by talking about what are, in my opinion, the top 40 best stories that have ever aired on the podcast. Now, all the stories I'm going to mention in this video are free. I'm not talking about any that are like behind the paywall, so these are all available for anybody to go listen to. You can find them wherever you get podcasts, so Spotify, Apple, wherever. And if you want more detailed information on trigger warnings, or the authors that wrote these stories, or the voice actors who perform them, or any of that stuff, you can find that information in the podcast descriptions on like whatever podcast app, or you can find them at the nosleeppodcast.com. And so yeah, with all that said, I guess let's jump into the list.
Brace yourself for the No Sleep Podcast.
Number 40 is going to be Jack in the Box. This is season 2, episode 25, and it's about a group of friends who do a midnight run to Jack in the Box, the fast food place, and not all is as it seems. And this is just a really fun little old-fashioned Reddit horror story. At number 39 is going to be Christmas Desert, season 18, episode 26. This is about a guy experiencing the aftermath of surviving a traumatic incident, and it's like about the ways that messes with his head, and along the way it really messes with my head in a way that I kind of enjoy. At number 38 is I Wasn't Alone Seeking Shelter from the Blizzard, season 16, episode 13, and the title's pretty self-explanatory with this one. It's just a very simple, straightforward, but effective little horror story. Number 37 is How to Summon the Butter Street Hitchhiker, season 12, episode 6. And this is about a guy who participates in an urban legend, and it's pretty straightforward, but it has just enough personality to make me enjoy it. At number 36 is Creeping Crimson, season 6, episode 25. This is about a couple who stop at a motel for the night and get a little bit more than they bargained for. And it's just another very simple, straightforward, but kind of creepy little horror story. At number 35 is The Suicide Orphan, season 9, episode 2. And I am not monetized on YouTube, so I can actually say that word. And this is a story about an orphan who causes people to commit suicide. And that might sound like a dumb premise, but the story is really well written, and so it really works. At number 34, keeping with that theme of self-deletion, is Room 733, which is season 4, episode 15. And this one's about a dorm room where everyone who stays in it ends up offing themselves. And it's creepy, and it works on an emotional level, and I enjoyed it. At number 32 is The Shatterbox, which is New Year's 2023, Volume 1. And this is a sort of like a Saw type of story, except with, like, aliens, where it's like this evil board game that makes people do things that they really don't want to do. And this one is just a bitter, brutal, bleak story, and it's one of the few stories on the podcast that genuinely managed to disturb me on a really deep level. At number 31 is Black on Black, season 6, episode 1. And this is about a girl who sees something in the corner of her room and is like scared of the dark, which is like a, common childhood fear. But in this case, there is a little bit more legitimacy to her fear. And I thought this one was just really creepy in the way that it takes this like childhood fear that most of us have kind of managed to overcome and get past to a certain degree, and basically says like, no, actually, there's a actual reason to be afraid of the dark. And so it's kind of creepy in that way. At number 30 is Autopilot, season 2, episode 25. And I don't know how to really talk about this one without giving too much away, but I'm just going to say this is handily one of the most disturbing, like, Reddit horror stories. It's kind of infamous in the online world, and yeah, if it'll really fuck you up. All right, it's a fucked up story. At number, and the reason why it's so fucked up is because it's just so real. Yeah, definitely trigger warning for that one. At number 29 is Girl on Fire, season 12, episode 21. And this is about a woman who runs away from her abusive father and ends up gaining, like, superpowers. It's a very Carrie-esque type story. At number 28 is Licking Bathroom Floors, season 17, episode 17. This one's pretty vile, and so it works as, like, effective gross-out horror. Kind of makes me want to throw up. But it's not just here because of that. It is also clever and witty and subversive and well-written enough. And it has a real wry sense of humor to it that really works. And so it's good on a lot of levels, but just be warned, it is just absolutely disgusting. At number 27 is It Was Called the Hating Tree, season 8, episode 20. And this one's about a tree that has like supernatural powers and the way that it affects the townspeople who live nearby to it. And this one just really stood out to me because it has this oddly tragic ring of truth to it that just really sticks with you and feels true to life. At number 26 is Eater, season 4, episode 22. And this is about a girl who is haunted by a spirit and ends up finding an unusual solution to her problem. And this one is here because it's just such an insanely creative concept. Like, whoever came up with the concept of this story deserves to get an award because holy crap, like, how creative is this? At number 25 is How Not to Get Rid of a Body, season 13, episode 19. This is, well, the title is pretty self-explanatory on this one. And this is just some really gory and effective horror comedy. At number 24 is Soft White Dam, season 5, episode 18. And this is one of the most famous stories on the Nosleep podcast. Like, basically anytime you see a list where people are talking about their favorite stories, this one always manages to show up on those lists. And it's there for good reason, because I think this story is kind of just a perfect example of what the podcast is supposed to be when it's working correctly, which is that it's just an effective, creepy, atmospheric little story. It's well written, it's well performed, the musical accompaniment and the sound effects and everything work to really like add to the story and suck you into it. Just overall, straightforward, simple, but really solid little horror story. At number 23 is Burn, season 6, episode 6. And this is a story that's written from the perspective of like a letter where it's this guy writing to his friend and explaining what happened on a Halloween many years before. And this is just a really beautifully written little story that may or may not get a little tear out of you. At number 22 is The Rosie Hour, season 7, episode 15. And this is about an employee at a call center who starts getting calls from this strange old woman whose name is Rosie. And, yeah, this is just a really, really fun story. One of the funnest stories that I've heard on the podcast. At number 21 is The Odd Kids, season 5, episode 12. This is about a boy who makes a discovery in the woods around his grandparents' house. And this one just has a really cool, creepy little concept. It doesn't necessarily do anything all that crazy or out there, but it just has that cool concept and executes it in a way that's really satisfying. At number 20 is The Pocket Watch, season 7, episode 2. This one is kind of similar to Autopilot, where it's a pretty short little Reddit horror story, but it's incredibly fucked up, and it's one of those that will just leave you with a sick feeling in your stomach. At number 19 is The Hidden Webpage, season 9, episode 25. And this is about a man who receives an email from an old acquaintance that takes him down an internet rabbit hole with some very creepy and unsettling consequences. And this story so easily could have been like a top 10, top 5 level story. Like, for most of the story, it's absolutely brilliant and genius. The only thing that holds it back is the ending, which is a major cop-out. I wish this author, Jared Roberts, had come up with any better way to end the story. It kind of felt like he painted himself into a corner. But despite that flaw, it's an insanely creepy and well-written little internet horror story that does a great job of like creating that little shiver down the spine, that little tingly sense of the uncanny that I really love. At number 18 was It Was a Different Time, which is season 11, episode 16. And this is about two friends who discover an abandoned mall with some very strange properties to it. And this is just a really creative story that I just really enjoy the hell out of. Don't mind the change of clothes. I just had to reshoot this segment the next day after I recorded the original video. But at number 17 is See Me, season 20, episode 23. And this is one where a female serial killer tells her origin story of how she got started with, serial killing people. And the thing that is so great about this story is that it's about a character who is really a bad person doing really bad things. And yet it's so insanely well written that I actually found myself sympathizing with this character, which is actually like that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. Like that's something that it actually takes skill as a writer to do. And I just found the character to be insanely compelling, even though she's clearly a bad person. At number 16 is Goat Valley Campground, and this is not one story. It is a collection of, I think, like 10 different stories that aired from season 17, episode 14, through season 17, episode 23. And so it's like a series. And basically the premise of this like series is that there is this campground that is like this ancient land where all of these like Lovecraftian cosmic horror monstrosities are living in the woods in this campground. But it's also a campground where people just go out to recreationally spend time with their families and stuff. And it follows the woman who like owns and runs the place as she tries to keep her campers safe and keep her campground from getting shut down by the government after these, monsters are like killing her campers. And it's kind of maybe a little bit, I guess, creepy or gory or whatever at times, but really it became over time kind of like a comfort listen where I would just start to look forward to whenever I would get the chance to listen to the next episode that featured a Goat Valley Campground installment, because it was just kind of, it was like comfort food, and so I really enjoy it for that reason. At number 15 is The Bottom of the Barrel, which is a Halloween 2017 episode. And this is not a very scary story. It's just a very good Halloween-themed tale that has a little teeny bit of horror mixed in there. But really, it's just a great story with great characters that really kind of sucks you in and gets you invested. At number 14 is What Goes Down Must Come Up, season 19, episode 14. And this is a story about a woman who enjoys and is addicted to throwing up. Yes. When I listening to it for the first time, when I realized what the premise was, I just immediately turned against it. I'm like, this is such like cheap, gross out garbage. I was just totally not with it. But the story was so good that it took me from that place all the way around to the end where I was just full on going like, holy crap, this is one of the best stories that I've ever heard on the podcast, because it's so well written, and it turns this kind of cheap, dumb premise into like this epic tale of like a woman trying to battle addiction and like overcome her past demons and stuff in order to like live for the people that she loves. And it's quite something. And so like if you're turned off by the premise, I don't blame you. I was as well. But I think it is actually a story worth hearing, for as crazy as that sounds. At number 13 is The Whistlers, season 5, episode 25. And this is a story about a group of explorers who go out into, I believe it's like Alaska or the Arctic or something like that, in search of these strange creatures called the Whistlers. And they end up getting lost in the wilderness. And it's just a very bleak survival story with this strange, almost like supernatural edge of these bizarre creatures that they're going after. Very interesting story. At number 12 is The Black Bag Job, season 14, episode 7. And this is about a guy who is like a locksmith by day, but a safecracker for thieves by night. And he gets hired on a very bizarre gig that has some weird consequences for him. And what I love about this story is just how casually it introduces this world of all these bizarre supernatural objects and entities and stuff. And it just sort of like goes, yep, this is a thing in this universe. This supernatural item has this power, and yep, that's it. And it does it in such a cool, creative way. I just love the world of this story. Now, I will warn you, this author made a couple of sequels to this story, and they are a case of seriously diminishing returns, where like the second one is like okay, I guess, and the third one is just garbage. But yeah, this first original story, if you just listen to it as a standalone story, it is actually really brilliant and really creepy and really great. At number 11 is Mummerman, season 5, episode 4. This is about a book club, a group of people at a book club who accidentally summon a monster. And this one goes for a sort of like surreal, nightmarish tone, which is something that generally doesn't work. Like, there's a lot of stories on the podcast that try and go for that sort of vibe, and they just don't work. But this is one of the only examples where that sort of vibe actually really works, because the story is just so unbelievably gruesome and nightmarish, and like, yeah, it really leaves you with this feeling of like ick after you're done with it. And so it's effective in that way. And now we're moving into the top 10, and like with these 10, you really can't go wrong with any of these. These are really great stories. Starting with number 10, which is The Kids in Cold Creek, season 6, episode 16. And this isn't really like a super scary or disturbing story. It is a bit suspenseful at one point, but honestly, I found the story to be very moving, because it is all about like family and the value of like community and stuff like that. And it's done in a sort of like horror story way. But I don't know, I found it to be a very touching story. And so even though it's not necessarily the scariest thing I've ever heard on the podcast, it's really stuck with me, and I felt like I had to mention it pretty high on the list for that reason. But let me look. Yeah, that's the last time that I can really say that about any of the stories on this list, because from here on out, all the ones that I'm mentioning are basically devastating to one degree or another. And so basically the next 9 stories here are stories that are going to probably ruin your day one way or another, but they're great. And so, they ruin your day in a great way. At number 9 is Do You Love Her, season 6, episode 24. And this is about an IT worker who like sort of accidentally uncovers some really messed up stuff on his boss's computer network. And yeah, it's just a really clever and genuinely kind of disturbing story that it was a really pleasant surprise, because I remember the day when I discovered it, I was just sort of reminiscing on how at that point we were probably in like, I don't know, season 15 or 16, and I was like, the stories these days are just not that great. They're not all that mature or clever or interesting. I'm kind of getting sick of the podcast. And so then I just randomly went back and chose this episode from season 6. And this story just boom, just exploded in my brain and blew me away. I'm like, holy crap, this is really great. And it's stuck with me ever since. At number 8 is Those Who Hunt Monsters, season 6, episode 4. And this is about a single father who grows suspicious of the new neighbor that moved in across the street and begins to wonder if the guy has bad intentions towards his son. And yeah, this one will stick with you. It'll, like I was talking about with ruining your day, this one will ruin your day. It'll rain on your parade. It's pretty rough, but it's also great and made a serious impact on me. And so, yeah, gotta give it its flowers. At number 7 is Better Days, season 6, episode 25. This is about a boy who discovers a parallel dimension, basically, and discovers a parallel version of himself there. And that's all I'm going to say in terms of the premise. This one, I can't say that this is objectively the most disturbing story on the podcast because, I mean, we've already talked about, what goes down must come up and the shatter box and whatnot. But honestly, out of all the stories that I've heard on the podcast, this is probably the one that disturbed me and the most, that left me feeling the most unsettled after the fact, and it really got under my skin. No pun intended if you've heard the story. At number 6 is The Good Thomas Shay, season 6, episode 13. And this is about a girl who has a sister who dates a killer. Her sister's boyfriend is a killer, and that ends up upending her entire life. And this one is just fucking devastating. I do think it maybe goes a little too far into the realm of sentimentality at a couple points, but not gonna lie, the sentimentality kind of worked on me. It's crazy. And especially if you the first time you don't know what to expect, and so it might not hit you quite as hard, but when you know where it's going and you listen to it for a second time, somehow it's actually even worse. This story is just brutal, but it's also kind of amazing, and it's one of the best. At number 5 is Graduating, season 15, episode 12. This is a really cool science fiction one where it's about these clones that are made in this lab, and their entire job basically is to get killed and then revived over and over again. And they get killed in various ways, and then they go through some kind of machine or some kind of technology that revives them again, and then they give reports about what it was like to get killed. And it's a really weird creative concept, but man, the way that they end up going about it and where the story ends up going really left me pretty shaken. It left me pretty shaken up after the fact, and it's just such a well-written story that, yeah, I think it's one of the best. At number 4 is It's Later Than You Think, season 19, episode 25. This is about a woman who takes mushrooms, and it basically changes her entire world. And yeah, this is a really surreal and unsettling story that it messes with time in a way that is weirdly creepy, and where it ends up going in the end, I'm not going to spoil anything, but trust me, just you got to listen through to the end, and it's worth it. At number 3 is My Dad Finally Told Me What Happened That Day, season 8, episode 25. This is from Jared Roberts, the same guy who wrote the Hidden Web page. And it has a lot of similar qualities to that one, where it does a really great job of creating those little creepy moments, that little shiver down the spine. But in this case, the story is just a tad bit better, and the ending is a whole lot better than the hidden webpage. And so this one just kind of soars. At number 2 is going to be Whitefall, season 12, episode 25. This is about a group of people who get stranded at a bus station called Whitefall, and it's about like what happens to them after. And this is a really disturbing, unsettling one. And one tip that I would give for listening to this one is that I recommend listening to it in one sitting. Like, don't break it up over multiple sittings. It is like a couple hours, but if you listen to the whole thing in one sitting, it gives you a certain effect that I'm not gonna go super into detail about, but I think it's like the way that the story is meant to be experienced, and so I highly recommend it. And yeah, just super well written story. But at number 1, the only story that really could go in this place, it's got to be Pen Pal, which aired in season 1. It was over the course of a couple episodes in season 1, so you can just find them there, just labeled as Pen Pal Part 1 and Part 2. But this story is a really great story. It's told in non-chronological order. So, it's got 6 pieces, but they're all kind of jumbled around, Pulp Fiction style. And in terms of the premise, all I'm going to say is that it starts out with a boy waking up in the middle of the woods with no idea of how he got there. And from there, it goes to some really crazy, awesome places. Pen Pal is very, like I talked about with the Jared Roberts stories, very good with the like chill up the spine, phenomenally creepy all the way through the story, and it ends in a way that is just utterly just fucking rips your guts out by the end. And so it's brutal, it's nasty, but I just think it is, yeah, the best story that ever aired on the podcast. But yeah, if you're a fan of the podcast, let me know what your favorite stories are in the comments. And with that said, I will see you in the next review.